What's the name of your presentation?
Steep turns.
Thank you, sir. Steep turns. I don't have one called steep turns.
Oh, that means I can do anything I like. right?
No, it doesn't. Is your stalls?
No, steep turns.
You,
So I'm going to start this with a little bit of an Alcoholic Anonymous type introduction, but my name is Craig Teerlink. I'm a pilot-holic, or a plane-aholic, I'm not sure which, and it's been 18 hours since my last steep turn. Right?
We love you, Craig.
Yeah. I've been a CFI for about 25 years now, and as so mentioned, I've had the privilege and pleasure to be a DPD for the FAA for about the last 12 years. I figure I'm coming up on approximately 3,000 check rides now. I do check rides on 11 different certificates, I think I counted this morning. And of those 11 different ratings that I evaluate, guess how many ratings do not involve a steep turn? Yeah. Guesses? Good question, though. No steep turns in the loop. The 11 ratings that I evaluate, or I'm sorry, yeah, the 11 that I evaluate, 10 require or have as an option steep turns. There's only one that does not. The instrument rating does not require a steep turn. In my opinion, maybe it should. We'll talk about that in a minute. So before we get started, I'd like to know who the audience is here. How many of us are student pilots here? That's what I wanted to see. That's what I wanted to see. All hands. Okay. How many are rated private pilots? Maybe a third. Commercial pilots. ATPs. How many ATPs have we got? 4 or 5, something like that. How many CFIs? I think we said we had 25, so maybe a third of the group there. Very good. As we mentioned, almost every check ride has a steep turn involved in it. I think the only maneuver that is more frequently evaluated is a normal landing. And I think that's maybe because takeoffs are optional, landings are mandatory. They're supposed to match. But usually a steep turn is involved in almost every check ride. And usually when I'm doing an evaluation, it's the first maneuver I want to see after that normal takeoff. And I have a pretty good idea after seeing a steep turn, oftentimes in both directions. In that first maneuver of, it takes all of what, maybe 60 seconds to do a steep turn once you're into it. I can usually evaluate in that first 60 seconds probably how the rest of the check ride's going to go. It is that telling. So we're going to go through here. What is a steep turn? Why does the FAA think it ought to show up on every check ride? Why does CAP think it should show up on every check ride? We'll talk about why in terms of what are the aerodynamics of steep turns. Why does the airplane do that? You know what the difference between a new pilot and an old pilot is? A new pilot asks, why is it doing that? An old pilot says, why is it doing that again? Okay, that's the only difference. So we'll talk about some aerodynamics behind steep turns, and then we'll get into how to successfully do these, since you're going to do them on every check ride for the rest of your aviation career. And we'll open it up for questions a little bit. What is a steep turn according to Uncle FAA or Uncle CAP? Any ideas here? What's involved? Come on, over.
45 degrees.
Okay, there's a specified bank involved. What else?
People within 100 feet.
Okay, there's usually an altitude involved. If you're a glider pilot, that one gets thrown away. I was once told by Salt Lake Approach, glider 1234 descend and maintain 10,000. I told her, ma'am, I'm a glider. I don't maintain anything. And then she told me, remain clear of class Bravo. Okay, so oftentimes there's an altitude involved. Anything else? Right?
Airspeed and heading.
Okay. So we usually have a specified bank angle, 45 for privates, 50 for commercials, plus or minus usually 5 degrees. We've got a specified airspeed that we need to maintain, plus or minus typically 10 degrees. We've got a specified altitude, plus or minus 100 feet. And we've got to roll out at plus or minus 10 degrees of our starting heading. So those are the observable portions of a steep turn. Is there anything else in the ACS or the pilot handbook of pilot flying handbook regarding flying a steep turn other than just those 4 criteria?
Things like taking into account overbanking tendencies.
Okay, overbanking tendency. We'll get into that. Anything else? Coordination. So sometimes I have a difficult time doing that, but yes, we'll get to that. Anything else? Okay. So let's jump into this. Let's see if my eraser works.
Can you move this back just a little bit so I can?
Sure. You bet. So how do we maintain these standards? Now I prepared a PowerPoint presentation for this and I sent it to Mr. Soder for evaluation. And he told me that 123 slides were too many.
Yeah.
So we're gonna largely see if we can do this on the whiteboard. The ACS mentions we're supposed to clear the area first, and we'll kind of give that as a given for all members. We need to make sure we don't run into anything or even get close to running into anything. And the ACS also goes on to mention that this is largely a visual maneuver. I take issue with that. I'll get back to that in just a moment. But let's talk about, first of all, why does an aircraft turn? Why don't you just do this to the yoke and it does that? My actual model. Mr. Hess, why does an aircraft turn?
Horizontal component of lift.
Okay. You will read that in the pilot flying handbook, and that is the first portion of why an aircraft turns. So let's think about this. This aircraft is in level flight. It's generating some vectors of force. The one on the main wing is largely up. It's horizontal to the relative wind and to the wing's lateral axis. We have a couple of other flying surfaces. We have a horizontal stabilizer, which I was surprised to find out as a young pilot. Does that hold the tail up? It holds the tail down. Most aircraft are designed such that the center of lift is behind the center of gravity. Therefore, the lift vector going up on the wing tends to push the nose down. So we need something on the back of the airplane to keep the tail down and the nose up. That's the horizontal stabilizer. That's important. Let's keep that in mind in just a moment. We've also got this vertical stabilizer. Why is that on the airplane?
You don't have to use the foot pedal.
Say again?
So you don't have to use the foot pedal.
Oh, so we don't have to use the foot pedals. I like that answer. I'll have to remember that. Okay?
It's wrong.
All right, so let's see what happens as we tilt this airplane. As we tilt this airplane or bank this airplane, that lift vector is still perpendicular to the lateral axis of the wing and to the relative wind. And so now we have the tilted lift vector. If we decompose that into a vertical and a lateral component of that lift vector, part of it is going up and part of it is off to one side. Since we lose some of the vertical component of lift, this airplane now has less lift than it weighs. What happens to any object that weighs more than it's supported by? It heads down. Okay? As this airplane starts to head down, however, its relative wind changes from slightly ahead of it to slightly below it. That increases the angle of attack on the wing, which increases the lift the wing produces, and within a relatively short amount of time, this airplane will again produce exactly as much lift as it weighs, usually no more than a few seconds. However, it has changed its flight path from level ahead to stabilized descent. Ooh, that's a good term. We'll have to remember that term. Okay? Okay. However, it also has a horizontal component of lift that's pointed in this direction. Are we going on time? So
You got 20 minutes.
20 minutes. Okay, I'm a third of the way through. Now, I want you to remember that horizontal component of lift because this is where the FAA material does not tell the full story. Okay? Let's assume this airplane's in level flight and we've got a 10-knot crosswind from this direction. What will be the ground path of the airplane? It's going to go in this direction, isn't it? What if I bank this airplane and generate a horizontal component force? We've got thrust vector forward, we've got lift vector upwards, a weight vector downwards, and now we've got a horizontal component. What is the path of the airplane going to be? It's going to fly in a bank, crab to the side. So what, pray tell, makes this airplane turn?
Vertical stabilizer.
Oh,
Actually, I should say, let me correct. It is all of the surfaces that have a vertical component.
let's think about all of the surfaces on this aircraft. Okay? As this aircraft is in a bank, where does the relative wind change to with regard to the control surfaces on the airplane? First of all, when we're flying straight ahead, where's the relative wind on this vertical stabilizer? Right down the front of it, isn't it? If we tilt it and now start going in this direction, where is the relative wind on the vertical stab?
Right.
It's now on one side, isn't it? Where is the center of gravity of this airplane? It's roughly where we sit. Okay? If we've got a force on one side of this vertical stab that's 10 feet behind the center of gravity, what's this airplane going to do? It's going to turn around that center of gravity, isn't it? And every time we turn 1 degree, what happens to the new relative wind? It changes by a degree. And that changes and changes and changes and changes all the way around. We call that weather vaning. Have you ever seen a weather vane on a barn? Which direction does it point? Always into the wind. Okay. Furthermore, let's talk about the vertical and horizontal component of the horizontal stabilizer. When it was in level flight, that vector pointed down. When we tilt it, it now has a horizontal component of lift. Which direction does it point? The other way. The other way. Now you've got a vertical stabilizer that is trying to weather vane. You have a horizontal stabilizer that is trying to rotate around its center of gravity. What's the flight path? Okay. If you go to the PHAC, you'll find the FAA says that turning flight is caused by a horizontal component of lift, and that is absolutely true. But that's what starts it. I wish they would tell the rest of the story. If you go to any good aerodynamics text, including aerodynamics for naval aviators, you'll find the rest of the story. Okay, so that's why turning flight. Let's talk about some other issues. We said that as we bank, we lose some vertical component of lift, and so we start down. What does the typical pilot do to correct that descending tendency?
Pull back.
They pull back on the stick, which does what to the elevator? It pulls the tail down a little bit, pulls the nose up a little bit, and so we get an increased angle of attack. With an increased angle of attack, what happens to the drag of this airplane? It increases. In some ways, that's good. That brings our lift back up to be exactly what we want the airplane to be. We stabilize our altitude. What happens to the airspeed if we have increased drag? It decreases. So how do we stay within that 10 knots of our desired airspeed? We must add power, okay? Recognize that turning flight by definition is accelerated flight. The definition of acceleration is a change of speed or direction. And in order to accelerate, either in speed or direction, we must add power. So if we want to maintain that airspeed, we've got to add a reasonable amount of power. Now, a couple of 3 times a year, I'm with usually a commercial pilot applicant in a light sport aircraft. They have all of 95 horsepower. And we go out typically to the Ogden practice area, and I ask them to show me a steep turn. And they pick 8,000 feet and 80 knots. And it's a 100-degree day in the afternoon in July. And I noticed as they start this turn, they're right on 80 knots. And I also kind of take a peek at their throttle and their tachometer, and they're already at 100% power. And they roll over to that 50-degree bank, and they start pulling back on the stick, and their airspeed starts dropping, and then their altitude starts decreasing. And about the time they get all the way around, they're 300 feet low and 20 knots slow. And they scream at me, "But it worked this morning." What's wrong with this picture?
Density altitude.
Density,
Okay.
weight, power, weight.
Turning flight requires additional power. Please remember that. If you don't have additional power to give, you are sunk before you start. Yes?
Would you include a horizontal component of thrust in your discussion of the forces that are acting on the aircraft and turning flight?
If we have time, yes. Okay. I'm running slow already. Okay. So you must have some additional power to give. So this comes back to what speed should you select? It's your choice as to what speed you select for a steep turn.
One slow enough, you have some power to add.
Ah, I like that answer. So how slow is too slow? What? Let me ask this question a different way. At what speed does your airplane have the most excess power to give?
Best flying.
Best climb speed, VY. By definition, that is minimum drag speed. In 182, that's what, 72, 73 knots, something like that, max force weight. Okay. So if you're concerned about power, try to pick a speed that is close to VY. Now, most of our airplanes are going to get a bit mushy down around VY. So if you've got enough excess power to give, you might select a little bit higher than that, maybe 75, maybe 80, something like that. But if you're in a sport cruiser that it takes everything you've got just to maintain 80, you're sunk. It ain't going to happen. So pick a speed that you've got excess power to give. Now let's talk about some limitations. Most of us are flying normal category aircraft. They have a G load limitation of 3.8 positive Gs, and we're going to be pulling positive Gs at a steep turn. Loading is proportional to the 1 over the cosine of the bank angle. And I don't expect you to memorize that. But most of us have normal category aircraft that are rated up at 3.8 Gs. If you do just a little bit of algebra, you'll find that you'll hit 3.8 Gs at 75 degrees bank. It's actually about 74.9, but we'll call it 75, okay? So now the question is, what is the stall speed at 3.8 Gs? It's the square root of that, okay? So the stall speed of this aircraft is going to increase in a steep turn. Yes, 10 minutes. Okay, I'm getting there. So the stall speed is going to increase. So you got to be cognizant of what the stall speed is in this airplane. So if it stalls at 50 and we're pulling 4 Gs, the square root of 4 is 2 times 50. We're going to stall at 100 knots. So it's probably not good to choose 100 knots if you've got an airplane that stalls at 50. On the other end of the spectrum, if you are pulling 3.8 Gs and you go a little bit higher than that, you're now exceeding aircraft limitations, possible structural damage. So you'd like to be slower than what we call maneuvering speed. In the Cessna 182, that's about 110 knots, 111 knots at max gross weight. So let's see, as a pilot, I've got all sorts of decisions to make on speed, okay? It's got to be lower than 111. 72, 73 is probably the lowest drag speed, that's a power issue. It's got to be higher than the accelerated stall speed of the airplane. You've got a little bit of homework to do before you jump into a steep turn on a check ride. Now, there are some recommended speeds. You might want to look those up in the AFM or talk to your buddy or your CFI. But in a 182, you're probably looking at about 90 knots as a good speed. Now, let's talk a little bit about some other issues that we've got. What causes this airplane to bank? We're going to hang some control surface out in the wind. If we bank this way, what happens to the ailerons? Right one goes down, left one goes up. Is that correct?
Okay.
If I hang the right aileron down, what happens to the lift produced by that right wing?
Increases.
It increases. And the byproduct of lift is drag. If we've got more drag on one wing than on the other wing, what's the airplane going to do? It's going to yaw. Okay, so we're going to be banked in this direction, but yawing in this direction because of a whole lot of other things. We've kind of got a curved path. But what's going to happen to the slip skid indicator? It's going to go whoop. I've flown with Jason, he knows this. Okay, that hurts, huh? Okay, so in a bank in either direction, we're going to need a little bit, emphasize a little bit of rudder control to bring that adverse yaw back into play so we were flying a coordinated turn. Okay. We've got some other problems also. Most of us are flying single engine piston airplanes with this big spinny thing out front. Okay. How many of you have worked with a power drill? You're drilling through a piece of lumber or something and you hit a nail and you hit an obstacle in that drilling process. What happens to the drill in your hand if the bit slows down? It tries to break your wrist, okay? I think Mr. Newton called this an equal and opposite reaction. Okay? So if we've got the propeller turning clockwise in front of us, we'll turn it around here. If the propeller is turning clockwise, what does the airplane want to do? It wants to turn counterclockwise. Now this begs a question. Why doesn't this airplane just constantly roll to the right as it flies? What keeps it from doing that? Yes. That wants to make it turn to the left and roll to the left, both. So what prevents it from doing that?
It has aerodynamic design factors that help.
There was an engineer behind this design. And you might think that this airplane has symmetrical wings. It doesn't. It doesn't. you will find that there are enough relative wind aerodynamic factors such that this airplane constantly, if it had no power, wants to turn this way. So that when the engine is running, it counteracts that rotational tendency and it flies in level flight. You'll also notice that the ailerons on each wing have a different upward throw and downward throw. Okay. That's also some engineering factors. But long story short is this airplane is designed from an engineering standpoint to exactly counteract that torque effect, both in level flight, maybe not so much in turning flight. Because we have this torque effect in turning flight, turning to the left is helped by or exacerbated by the torque effect of this engine. So we're going to find that turning left tends to overbank the airplane, both because of the torque effect and because of the outside wing producing slightly more lift. It's traveling a further distance than the inside wing. And between the two, this airplane, once it gets past about 30 to 40 degrees, it just wants to keep going. Have you noticed that? What does a pilot do with that?
Opposite
Opposite
Opposite aileron. You'll find that in a left-hand turn, you have to hold just a skosh of right aileron to maintain it in that 45-degree bank. If you've got right aileron hanging out, what does that do to the yaw factor? What does that do to the total drag? What does that do to the airspeed involved to keep it at 90 knots or whatever you've selected? You've got a lot of things going on here. What happens when we turn and go the other direction? Now you're working opposite of the torque effect. You still got this overbanking tendency caused by inside wing, outside wing. But now your bank is opposite of the torque effect. You don't have to produce as much opposite aileron in a right-hand turn as a left-hand turn. What does that do to the drag on the airplane? Not as much drag in a right turn. Have you ever noticed in your steep turns that you always speed up about 3 or 4 or 5 knots on the right turn as opposed to the left turn? There's a lot going on here. Well, I'm going to jump down to the how for just a moment. We've erased it. How do you successfully fly a steep turn? We've talked about how you pick airspeed, how you pick altitude. Please pick an altitude that you've got sufficient power left over to stay on speed during the steep turn. Now you're supposed to stay within 10 knots of your entry speed. Let's say we're picking 90 knots to start. How quickly will 182 speed up from 90 to 110 if you just push the throttle in? Does it act like an F-15? Does it just go, or is it more? Okay. It's going to think about it, isn't it? Now, the PHAC in the airplane flying handbook suggests to bank to 30 degrees before you increase power. I've decided, why? Go ahead and set the power to what you believe is going to be appropriate. It's not going to speed up 10 knots in the next 5 seconds. Set your power, start your bank. Slowly, emphasize slowly, roll over to that 45 degrees. On your way over, we already know that it's going to take some additional pitch to maintain the lift that we need. How many of you like to struggle with that elevator control all the way through? Or if you're lazy like I am, Cessna did a lot of work at putting in trim control in these airplanes. About 2 rolls up of the trim, as you roll over to that 45 degrees, you will find that this airplane will maintain altitude almost hands off. And if you're really good at tweaking it, it'll fly an entire turn hands off, on altitude, on speed. It's scary the first time you watch it do this. Okay. This is a visual maneuver. You should be looking outside most of the time. But guess what? Your check pilot is gonna evaluate your performance by looking at gauges. They're gonna look at that attitude indicator for 45-degree bank. They're gonna look at that airspeed control for speed. They're gonna look at the altimeter for altitude, DG, I'm out. 1 minute, 2 minutes, what do I got?
6 seconds.
6 seconds. What questions do we have in 6 seconds? Okay? Go out and practice steep turns with an emphasis on this kind of knowledge. I think you'll be much more successful. It's going to show up on every check. Thank you.